Okay, we're good. Welcome everyone to the June 9th, 2020 Heritage Richmond Hill meeting. Tonight's meeting is an electronic meeting being held during an emergency pursuant to section 238, 3.3 of the Municipal Act 2001. Due to efforts to contain the spread of COVID-19 and to protect all individuals, city facilities will not be open to the public to attend meetings until further notice. We have received 2 regrets from committee members, Anthony Young and Barbara DeMambro, for tonight's meeting. The public had the opportunity to submit written correspondence regarding agenda matters by email to the clerk's office. All written correspondence received by noon today would have been included on the agenda, but there were none received. The public also had the opportunity to apply to appear as an electronic delegation either by video conference or by telephone by noon today, and there was also none received. With that, can I have a motion to adopt the agenda for tonight?
I move we adopt the agenda.
Thank you, Doris.
Good evening, Chair.
Discussion, Dan?
Yeah, I just wanted to know if we could add an item to the agenda, which basically is an update on the demolition of the, I guess, 127 Yonge Street. I understood that the demolition, I know from council that they agreed to the demolition, and I understood that the demolition was progressing, but I had heard a couple comments about some of the heritage features and stuff, and I was hoping that maybe we could have an update on that, maybe a discussion.
Yes, I can certainly allow that. Can I have, so you are making that motion to add agenda item update regarding the demolition of.
Excuse me, Chair. I think that we cannot add items to the agenda at the meeting. Usually we need it to be ahead of time to be part of the printed agenda. What we can do is we can maybe provide this to be added to next month's agenda so that we can provide an update.
Morteza, is it not part of when we look at the review the minutes, they have put updates on what's happened with the last minutes. So I think that will address some of Dan's issues. Dan's desire to have an update.
Yes, perhaps. And I was also thinking that as part of the subcommittee's item, maybe that question could come up there as well. But certainly would like to hear from staff as to any updates on that item. So if we cannot add an agenda item, then we can proceed with the approval of the agenda. So, I mean, back to staff, one would think that the reason we have the approval of agenda as an item here is to have this discussion. Is that not the case? Maybe clerks can advise.
I think that ultimately the reason why this has occurred is that oftentimes, if there was an interest in discussing an address, we need to notify the owner. And so, you know, if the discussion of a specific property is included in the agenda, we will be able to notify the owner. And if they choose to come and provide information, they could. So that's generally the reason why we actually needed a notification ahead of time. I think that is really the reason.
Okay, I'm not sure exactly what the, are we asking for additional information here, or maybe just as a matter of principle, can we or can we not add agenda items? And
no, I have not seen that. I think that has been established about 7 or 8 years ago, for the reason being previous couple of heritage committee member really was very interested in the going-ons of the town in a very consistent manner. And so I think that clerks has identified that that might be an issue because most of the time staff are not able to provide the answer. And it's not because of this particular case, but generally. And I think that that has been established in the last few terms.
Al, I see your hand up. Did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, just a point of order. In general, there's no issue in adding items to an agenda at the start of a meeting. It's a common practice and it's allowed by Robert's Rules of Order. I'm not aware that this town has any prohibition on that. With respect to the point that it's addressing a particular property, without knowing what Dan specifically means to address, if it's just providing information that's open source to the public, I don't see any issue. And it's only if we're asking for input or making a decision of some sort, then I would see it would be reasonable to invite the property owner. But again, if Dan's just providing information that is available to the public in general, I don't see any issue with that.
That sounds reasonable to me. Yes, Ryan, thank you.
Through you, Chair. What we have on the agenda in terms of the for item 3.2, where there's discussion about the extract, certainly when that motion is up, Dan would be able to speak to it. But that being said, there's nothing in procedure bylaw that would prevent the addition of business. Mind you, that in general, though, those would be emergency time-sensitive matters that you would need to add. So that would be, my suggestion is that it would be discussed during the extracts. I believe that's the address that 127 Yonge Street. Dan would be able to speak to it when that item comes up for the minutes of the previous meetings, and he could have some discussion.
Thank you, Ryan. Councillor Silovets, please.
Thank you very much, Chair Behruz, and good evening, everybody. What I would like to suggest is, I understand what Joanne is saying on one hand, but I agree with Ryan, who's here representing the clerk's office, that we could have that question asked when we discuss the extract, and if there is a question that Dan asks that staff cannot answer because they're not prepared, because we don't like to blindside staff. So if they're not prepared and they are unable to answer the question, then we can just have it referred to staff and they can answer at the next meeting. That would be my respectful suggestion.
Thank you, Councillor. Al?
Mr. Chair, I just wondered, my understanding from Dan was that he was just providing information. So perhaps we could clarify what he would like to add, and then we can decide.
Thank you, Al. Dan, back to you. Would you like to discuss that or ask the question during the review of our minutes of previous meeting?
Yeah, I think that it works on the extracts or the previous minutes. It really just is a question about the demolition, and the recommendation that we made had some qualifying elements to it. I just wondered if that was in fact going on.
Okay, fair enough. So let's proceed with the approval of the agenda as we have it, and when we come to that item under the extracts, we'll hear from you again, Dan. So all those in favor of tonight's agenda? Any opposed? Thank you, that is carried. Are there any pecuniary interests to be declared tonight? Seeing none, let's proceed to the next item. The approval of the minutes of the previous meeting. Do I have a motion for the approval of the meeting minutes? Thank you, Marge. Discussion, please.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yes, go ahead, Dan.
Just a clarification. In the minutes, when we're talking about again that address, the 127, there's an implication, and maybe it's not written in the wording. Maybe I'm just being specific on the wording, that all of the committee members agreed with the demolition, that sort of thing. I mean, per se, and that's not the case. There was one person who didn't agree with that. So I don't know whether it warrants a changing. I'm open to advice on that, but it just didn't seem clear to me. It sort of left me with the impression that everybody had sort of said, yeah, well, I guess we should demolish this. And that wasn't the case.
Is that a clarification you're asking of staff?
Yes, I guess. Does that warrant changing the minutes to sort of reflect that, or am I just being overly sensitive?
I know usually when there's a unanimous vote, maybe I should rephrase that. Sometimes I've seen when there's a unanimous vote that it is noted as carried unanimously. In this case, I don't believe it is. Joanne, would you like to address Dan's comment, please?
I'm going to ask Ryan in terms of the recording or the updating of any minutes. I think that basically it's clerk's responsibility to manage this process related issues. So I'll ask Ryan to help with us.
Thank you, Joanne. Ryan.
Through you, Chair, if I understand correctly, the minutes, the request is for the minutes to be changed because it doesn't show that it was carried unanimously. Is that through you, Chair, to
Yeah, sorry, Ryan. Maybe it's just the wording, like, and I can't actually find it specifically, but I think there was a comment in there that's saying the committee, implying I think all of us agreed that the building had to be demolished, but that wasn't the case. There was one person who didn't agree with that, and the wording sort of implies to me that we all agreed to it. And I just wanted, the vote wasn't recorded, but I thought in the minutes at least there might show something in there. I don't.
I have that item here in front of me, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan, when I'm reading under 5.3 of the minutes, second paragraph is that all committee members discuss the obligations that the property owners should have when purchasing a designated home under the Ontario Heritage Act, and we're all in agreement that the building located at 10027 Yonge Street had to be demolished regrettably because of its current state. So I think is that the sentence you're referring to, Dan, there? We're all in agreement, that part of that sentence?
Yeah, I think that's the part that struck me as implying that it was unanimous, and it was.
So through you, Chair, based on that paragraph, so I understand that they were all in agreement that it should be demolished. Based on the motion or the recommendation of council that's further down, there were some additional conditions. And if I recall the meeting, there was discussion regarding, carefully dismantling, disassembling, and a few things from there. So it might be that they may have agreed with demolishing the building, but perhaps they may not have agreed to some of the other parts of the motion that happened to be there. But
In fact, Ryan, if I may, through you, Chair, in fact, I think it's the opposite. I think that we have committee members who did not support demolition, but did support all of the conditions that we put in place, such that they were much more supportive of those requirements as opposed to the actual demolition.
In fact, that reminds me that was an item I brought up in the question I had about bundling the two aspects of this into one recommendation. But I understand Dan's point, and I'm looking at this paragraph. It almost seems that that second part of paragraph 2 can be deleted, because the recommendation is clear what the committee is agreeing to, and I don't see a need to repeat that here in the second part of paragraph 2.
So through you, Chair, we do have the, if I'm not mistaken, these minutes will be going forward, if they haven't already, to council for approval. We can, I'm not sure, it's possible this is sort of, I would call an administrative error, in the sense that perhaps the minutes were not taken or need to be adjusted, and perhaps not everyone was in agreement or that sort of thing. I'll take back and see what we may need to do, but
Excuse me, Ryan. I think that, excuse through the chair, the whole purpose of actually coming back with the minutes to the committee is ensure that everyone agrees to the minute. So this is actually the time for us to review. And generally, it's only through this process that only after that the members will vote to whether to endorse the minute or not. So I think the minute, because there is actually no time sensitive matter, can be revised and to provide it back to HRH members for their final approval at the next meeting.
through you, Chair, yeah, that's correct. My apologies. I understood that this was probably going forward to tomorrow's council meeting, but yeah, if we can make the adjustment to that second paragraph and bring it back to the next HRH meeting for your further approval before it goes to council.
So the adjustment, thank you, Ryan, would be to delete the second part after the word act, comma, would be act period. The second part would be deleted up to the end of the second paragraph. I also look at the last paragraph of item 5.3, where it implies again, based on what I'm hearing from Dan, that committee members were in agreement that because of the circumstances, they would support the recommendations contained in the staff report. I think that also requires rewording based on the same principle.
Yep, through your chair, we'll make that adjustment and bring it back to the next meeting for the committee's approval.
Okay, are there any other discussions on the minutes of the previous meeting? Okay, seeing none, so then the motion is to approve with the comments.
I think Al's got his hand up, Morteza.
Oh, my apologies. Thank you, Councillor West. Al, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Councillor West. Just to this issue, perhaps just to keep things moving along, I don't really see that there's a massive change. And if the clerk's office could just make the change, and perhaps we could just have it displayed, there's no reason why we can't just approve it tonight. And that's the general purpose of reviewing minutes. You make the changes, you can discuss them while everybody's here, and then you can move on, unless it's a substantial change. And this seems like a very simple change to make.
Through your chair, I can bring up those minutes. I just have to bear with me while I pull them up, if I can find them with what we have.
And Mr. Chair, just to keep things moving along, perhaps we could just proceed and revisit that item. I don't believe there's any prohibition on doing that through Robert's rules or any of the city's rules.
Yep, yeah, you can continue on. We certainly can come back to it.
Okay. Okay, so then we'll move on to the next item. As I mentioned earlier, there are no delegations tonight. Our scheduled business is a item for the designation subcommittee, although the designation subcommittee has advised that they will not be making a presentation regarding changes to the Ontario Heritage Act and impact on the municipality. In place of a presentation, they have submitted discussion material, which has been included in the additions memo as agenda item 5.2. With that, I will hand it over to the designation subcommittee to discuss the paper that was submitted along with this agenda. And sorry, I see your hand up, Ryan. Did you want to say something?
Through you, Chair, I did find the minutes. It just took me a couple more seconds than I thought it would be. I can bring this up now if you would like to go through that. That way we won't have to go back to it.
Fair enough. Let's do that then. Thank you. Are you going to put it on the screen for us? Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So just to clarify, so it was something to this where we had the act and that second portion of the wording was to be removed, correct?
Yes. And the last paragraph, if we can move down to that portion.
In terms of this, I missed the last paragraph of what needed to be.
So what is the purpose of the last paragraph? I guess it's almost kind of, reiterating what the motion is, but implying that, again, all members were in agreement, whereas that was not the case.
So it would be to remove the whole last paragraph. Would that be?
Any comments, Dan? Since
I was going to say, I mean, what you're really trying to say is the majority members were in agreement, but implying that not everybody was in agreement. I don't have a problem with that part. That's all.
Morteza, may I make a comment?
yes, Marge, please go ahead.
Actually, it's sort of a question of clarification. When we say the committee makes agrees on something, I interpret that it was a group joint. You could have some of the committee not agree, but it was a majority decision. So when you say members of the committee agree, that really is inferring a majority, not necessarily all of them. I'm wondering if Ryan can make a ruling on that.
So typically, yes, the committee members don't necessarily mean all of the committee members. I think with the previous adjustment in the second paragraph, we're all were in agreement. I think that is clear, but in the sense of that committee members were in agreement, doesn't necessarily mean that it has to all of the committee members. Just that, there was, let's say, a majority were in agreement with
Thank you, Ryan. I just wonder, why do we need to reiterate if, the motion itself is supporting a staff report, why is it needed to reiterate that, maybe the part that says committee members were in agreement can stay, but what they were in agreement was that they would discuss options and recommendations related to the demolition. Otherwise, it's inherent in the approval of that item that members agreed one way or the other to the recommendation. But I do see Al's hand up. Please go ahead, Al.
Mr. Chair, just presenting some options. There is the possibility, as you pointed out, that perhaps that paragraph is redundant and creates some ambiguity by its presence. So perhaps we could remove the paragraph if that solves the issue. Just further to the clerk's comments, perhaps the issue in the wording of that paragraph is that it reads committee members. And I agree with Marge's comments that generally when you would say a committee, it does not mean unanimous, it just means the majority. But I think what's causing confusion in that particular sentence is that it reads committee members. And that turns one's mind to suggest that the individual members were in agreement. Whereas if you say a committee, as opposed to committee members, by saying committee, that suggests just the committee passed it as a majority and does not imply that there was unanimous agreement. So if we choose not to remove that paragraph, perhaps we could adjust the first couple of words of that paragraph to say the committee was in agreement, or the committee supported, or something to that effect, so that it's just the committee, because the committee is really the governing body, the decision-making body. And by putting the word members in there, we're bringing it down to one level to individual members.
Mm-hmm. I want to build on that. I think there's value in the second part of that paragraph, which is to discuss options and recommendations related to demolition by neglect. And I don't want to lose that part. And maybe the intent of that last paragraph was just that. So I'm inclined to remove the redundant part, but keep the second half, which is a segue into the discussion tonight for the subcommittee to discuss demolition by neglect. Yes, I think that would be a fair change. Any other comments, suggestions on this?
Councillor Silovitz,
yes,
Chair.
please go ahead. Sorry, I didn't have my title.
That's okay. I guess you couldn't see my hand. No problem. That's exactly what I was going to suggest, because the first part of it is basically already there. As you say, it's redundant. But I did want to keep the second part of the of that paragraph in there, because that is very important. Thank you.
Thank you for the support. Any other comments?
Yeah, I basically agree. I agree with that. So I think that would be fine.
Okay, so all those in favor of approving the minutes of previous meeting as amended? Any opposed? It is carried. Thank you. And thank you, Ryan, for that great suggestion.
Oh, excuse me, Ryan, through the chair. Would this be appropriate time to actually bring the update about the demolition at 10027? Because I don't think that we would specifically go back to that address after we finish with this topic.
Thank you for that reminder. Dan, you had your hand up?
Yeah, no, I thought we were going to talk about the extract section, and in that section where it refers to the 127, I was just going to simply ask the staff the status of the demolition and the particular artifacts.
So I can provide that update now, if it's all right with everyone. Yes?
Yes, please go ahead.
Ryan?
Oh, sorry, Ryan, go ahead.
We have done the minutes. We just need a mover for the extracts.
Okay.
I see Councillor Silovets moving the extract. Item 3.2, discussion, please. Joanne, please go ahead.
Yes, the demolition was approved by council on May 27th, and there were conditions as part of the demolition permit being issued, is the fact that we will negotiate with the owner to retrieve some of the heritage attributes that is possible for future adaptive reuse. And the demolition actually started on, I think, the weekend after the 27th. But at that time, we actually have made an agreement with the owner. And what we have actually salvaged is, Ryan, can you give me the share of the yeah.
Go ahead, Joanne.
So as you see on the screen, what we have saved is the circular window, the 3 flat-headed original window frames, as well as.
Sorry, I don't see.
Oh, am I not showing?
I don't see your screen. I see the tiles.
Yeah, I can
you
see
see?
it.
I see it.
I can see that's the comment.
Oh, I see it now. Thank you.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, and I'm just going to also show you there are 2 leather window on the newer part of the structure that we actually managed to save. They're not in the best of shape, but we actually have all these pieces that can be incorporated in the future development. In addition, we actually managed to retrieve about 70 to 80 pieces of the red brick. That is from the original masonry structure. And also those are actually stored in the Public Works facility for future adaptive use. And this is our update.
Good.
Thank you, Joanne.
You.
Any questions for Joanne? Okay. Thank you very much again. Let's move on to scheduled business, item 5.1, designation subcommittee. And I assume, Dan, you will be speaking to that.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to just make a couple comments just to introduce it and give a bit of an overview. I'm going to assume that everybody's read it and then just open it up for discussion through you, Mr. Chair. So basically, just to sort of bring this back to where we started, and actually it was related to the Yonge Street property we just discussed, but in conjunction with other items have come forward over the past year or so, there was a recommendation that maybe we could put something together, the subcommittee could put something together to give some thoughts on it. So that's basically what this is. The key elements, I think, are I talk about incidences that created the paper. Talks a little bit about the trends, but I think recently with changes in the legislation, it's sort of timely to sort of bring this up and talk about it, because there is a section in the changes recently that try to address demolitions and alterations to heritage properties and how they should be treated. It's a little bit ambiguous. I remember, I think about a year ago, we had a discussion about um, structures and what structures meant and the interpretation of that as to whether it was a building or elements of the building, that sort of thing. So this all, I think, shows that the province has actually had these discussions as well, and they're trying to clarify. The other key thing in the legislation that I think was important, and I put it into the document, was principles. There, and Joanne, maybe you can help me on this, because if I understood from Pamela's original presentation on Bill 108, there were things to follow from that bill, clarifications such as prescribed principles and prescribed events. I haven't seen anything that actually says what the principles that they, are prescribing. So this document takes principles that came from a document that the government has published, and to my knowledge hasn't changed or done anything with. So it
Yeah,
talks about,
there's actually nothing. It was just a very large overview of what they're intending to do. We have not received any additional document since that point. I don't think that we were also in the dark as to how specific decision could be made. Something more specific that we don't know anything about. So yeah, at this point, there isn't any more information from our perspective to learn more about what the province intended to do. And I suppose COVID-19 just stopped all of that sort of discussion. And I think, so hopefully we will receive some more information.
so I mean, I took the liberty of taking a published document that talks about these principles and put it into this document, just to give people a sense of these principles. And one of the principles talks about continuing care, which I thought was relevant to the discussion. Another one is, I believe, accountability and transparency, which really translates more into a first future discussion on how do we list and how do we designate properties, how do they get on the register and stuff. And the subcommittee is putting a document together for that to sort of talk about. But I thought it was important to talk about these principles. And then I go into a specific change that I understand, and I've used the supporting document that was published by the ACO, which is Architectural Conservancy of Ontario. So that was one of the reference documents that I had provided, and it talks about the point that I made about demolitions and alterations, and how they were trying to clarify that because of, I guess, past misinterpretation and lack of consistency across municipalities and other people, other areas on that side. So I put that in there. And that's where we had the discussion, I believe at the last meeting, where we talked about the penalties that that could come into play in this particular instance. So that's a key element. And then there are a number of different things to talk about in this area. It's a broad area. So I talk about, for example, looking at it from a bylaw perspective, but it it can also go into other areas. And so for that particular reason, I ended the document with a suggested structure for future discussion. So there could be it could come into a motion that, depending on how our discussions go, if that's something that the committee would be interested in pursuing, in addition to just simply receiving the document. So that's sort of my overview comment, just to try to give you the thought process and some of the key elements to it. So I'll leave it to the committee to discuss or ask questions for clarification. So back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Dan. I want to commend you and the team for the work that you've done. I think the paper and the documents that you've provided are very informative and useful to this committee. And I also really like the structured approach that you're taking, and I'm hoping that maybe that would create the framework for future discussions and updates from the subcommittee that staff could also keep an eye on and be able to hopefully comment or educate us on those various topics that you have identified within that framework. So with that being said, are there any other comments or questions from the other members? Councillor Silovets, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Chair Barrows. And to Dan, I just wanted to make a statement to Dan and to all the members of the subcommittee. Congratulations. This is an excellent piece of work. And you've really done a superb job in bringing this together. I've never quite seen a document like this from a subcommittee on HRH. So I really want to commend you for what you've done. It is excellent. And I believe that it will be very welcomed by the public. So just wanted to put in there my thanks.
Thank you very much, Councillor Silovets. Al, please go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I just want to make sure that credit is given where credit is due, and to clarify that Dan is the initiative behind this document and the overall thought process, and the author of the document, much as he is humble and likes to share credit, I have to say he deserves the credit for this document and the initiative.
Thank you, Al, for the kind comments. I'm wondering that, this is a question for clerks, whether this or these documents are attached as part of the minutes of this meeting back to council, or do we need to have a motion for that to ensure that council receives these documents? Councillor West, did you have a comment?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dan, for this work and for your ongoing passion about pretty much anything that you seem to put your fingers into. So good job. I think this is a good document, and I think it addresses a number of very important things that we are dealing with on this HRH committee, and we've dealt with in other iterations of this committee as well. And I have also no doubt that other municipalities deal with this too. I think the question becomes that, and perhaps we don't necessarily need to do anything specific at the end of this discussion, but I think that it's fine for us to be beginning this discussion. But if really I think I would encourage us as a committee to decide where we go from here, because this is not an easy nut to crack. And I don't profess to have the answers either, but I wonder if maybe the next step is really for the subcommittee to go back and maybe have a sit down virtually, or hopefully someday soon in person with staff, and decide, like, what are some of the changes that we can make to address this problem, but not infringe on other people's rights that are like we don't want to be catching any bycatch in the net. So I'm happy to have this discussion. I'm glad we're doing it, but I think that we probably need to take another step at some point in the not very distant future as well. So those would be my comments. And again, thank you, Dan, for all the work that you're doing on this.
Thank you, Councillor West. Dan, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I do appreciate all the comments and thank you very much. It really was, like Al and Doris did, input whether the words are right down there, but the thoughts and the structure, and Joanne as well. So there were a number of people that really did contribute to this. But to open up the discussion, one of the attached reference documents that I had put with the discussion paper um, was a research paper, and it actually had Richmond Hill in it. And it was structured in a way that identified specific were really towards demolition by neglect, but they talked about a number of different areas and compared various municipalities with how they approach it. Because it is a multi-dimensional sort of approach. I mean, in some ways, there's a carrot and stick approach. You know, in some cases, you have penalties if somebody's doing it properly, and then on the other hand, you have some incentives, and we use some of those. So the grants that we talk about is an incentive to help people maintain the property. There's a we just talked about one of the changes through Bill 108, which is now legislation, talked about increasing the penalties in demolition versus alteration. So there's two examples. But and I'm going to sort of ask Joanne to help a little bit on this. Is that because that document had and it's dated, I know it's a number of years ago, but it did have comparisons in various techniques to address this Richmond Hill between other municipalities. You know, I'm sort of curious, and that's the reason why the structure for discussion was put forward as to sure the subcommittee can have some individual discussions on that, but I think it's something that would benefit the whole committee to talk about this, but in a structured way so that we have a subject to talk about that we can focus our attention. And, you know, it could be introduced by understanding what currently exists in Richmond Hill. So therefore, you know, staff would educate us a little bit more because personally, I find it very difficult reading the property standards bylaw on the website. I can't even find some of these things. So, you know, that would be a starting point. And then, you know, there, I'm sure in the document that was attached, it's out of date, so that, you know, staff could update us to say, no, that's not correct anymore. This is the case, and then we can go from there, and then identify if there's some room for improvement and what would that improvement be, that sort of thing. And that's something we could do behind the scenes as the subcommittee level. So, you know, I guess in response to Councillor West, you know, we can do some of this behind the scenes, but I think by breaking that out into these elements, we could, you know, educate the committee, have a discussion on it, come to a conclusion, you know, and maybe a recommendation that then could be brought to council. So that was my idea, as an evolution through this. And as I say, there will be another document that the subcommittee will come out, which would relate to the process of listing a property and what should be looked at, because we would be exposed, sorry, the city would be exposed that if we listed something and then it was challenged, you know, they would have to defend it. And right now, I'm not clear how one defends that, because getting on the register is something that is a little bit of magic right now. So, Joanne, I don't know if you have any comments on the reference paper that I put in, its date, if there's any substantial changes to some of the comments that they made about Richmond Hill. That's the only point I would make right now to let everybody know.
Thank you, Dan. Before I take Joanne, just so our discussion has some structure, I think what I'm hearing, Dan, is what you're trying to achieve here, and what I think the committee would want to achieve, and I stand to be corrected, is that we have a document that we would like to be on the record. We don't want this to disappear in the ether, and obviously council could receive this. The second part perhaps is, how do we structure future conversation and, bring in staff to that structure and framework and their comments and their expertise into that framework that would advise the committee and the subcommittee in future meetings. And if I recall, seeing that structure in your paper, that there's some meaningful steps that the subcommittee can follow, and staff having access to that allows them to be prepared for sort of the questions that the subcommittee or the committee might have. If that's fair, then maybe I go back to my question for the clerks as to what would it take for this to be received by council. Is it inherent in the fact that it's attached to these minutes, or is there a motion required for that by this committee?
So through you, Chair, just procedurally, before I answer, and so that we can get to that point, we did get a mover for 3.3 for the or 3.2 for the extracts, but we didn't have a vote on that. So before we, if we can vote on that, and then what we'll do is for 5.1, which is what we're talking here, I have adjusted the motion so that we make sure that the materials provided in the agenda they are sent to council for their information. I've added that in there, so once we sort of complete the extracts, I will bring up the motion for 5.1, which will then bring the additions, the materials to council.
Thank you. Yes, I appreciate it. Thank you, and I apologize. So with that, I'll take a small step back. 3.2, I believe we had a mover for that one, Councilor Silovets. I didn't call the vote on that, so I will call the vote on that now. All those in favor? Any opposed? Carried. And thank you again, Ryan. So back to item 5. Is there an amendment that, Ryan, you would like to read back to us for the scheduled business item 5.1?
Through your chair. So for 5.1A was the original motion that's on the agenda. I've added in B to say that the materials that were provided in the agenda, so in the additions agenda and revised agenda, the materials which committee member Kelly provided to the committee will be now sent to council for their information, of course, for their to do what they will.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Marge, please go ahead. Your microphone's off. Please turn that on.
Marge, you're still off.
Okay, sorry. I did read the document thoroughly, and I'm wondering, are we going to make some changes to it? There are certain points, expressions that I would like to see changed. Some things where I wouldn't have stated them that way. So is there going to be a review of the document, or are we going to send it to council as it is? Like, I thought there was discussion here that we would be reviewing it, hopefully in person sometime soon. So can you get that clarification?
I think if there's any comments, we should discuss it here. Please go ahead, Marge. Let us know what your comments are.
Okay. In what you refer to as the abstract, you've talked about it having a trend, but you've only looked for the Heritage Richmond Hill, and I would like to see a more in-depth analysis of the council's previous history. Joanne, you referenced what had happened to bring this whole idea forward back in the 80s, and how when the city was forming, we were tearing down buildings right, left, and center. So I think that needs to be part of the narrative for this. I don't know, and also the word right in your second sentence for the abstract, the decay of heritage assets. I find that a little strong, so that was another thing I noted. And you know, I question the thing about Mother Nature. I don't know if I would. I think I would use a more technical term for talking about that. It's yeah. Yeah, the whole idea that there is this trend, I think you put that out, but I think if it went to council, I feel like it needs more substance, that you put out these sort of concepts. And I would like to see them, again, backed up, verified, some bullet footnotes. And yeah, so that was something else that I noted. And then continue. Okay. Last point, last page, point 3, continuing care, was something that I. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Again, I was thinking that this would not be, that this would be reviewed more carefully. And I guess I'm surprised that I'm the only one who does believe that there should be. You know, Dan, you put an incredible amount of work, and I like the presentation. Ooh, I was impressed. But then when I read it, I thought, no, I still think the document requires a little more work before I'd like to see it go to council. So those are my points.
Mhm. Thank you, Marge. Councillor Silhouettes?
Thank you, Chair Berus. I don't disagree with what Marge is saying. I think some more footnotes are always good. I think it can be refined just a little bit more. My concern is also that we need to make sure we're wording it correctly with the motion that was put on the screen by Ryan. It needs to be very clearly stated when it goes to council that it is a discussion paper and it's not policy, because otherwise it may create more of a problem than we anticipate. So where the motion says for council's information, I just believe that it would be prudent on our part as a committee that it is very clearly stated that this is a discussion paper that has come out of the committee for the committee's purposes and information, and it's going to council respectfully and for their information purposes. Otherwise, I just really have a concern about what could actually happen to the integrity of the document as it leaves the committee's hands. Just a thought, and perhaps we can, you know, look at that and see what staff have to say as well in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other comments? Al, please go ahead. Al, your microphone's up. Okay, you're good now.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. I understand the concerns by Marge and Councillor Silhouettes, and I do agree that in general discussion is a good thing, to the point that it should be presented as a point of discussion or a starting point for discussion. It is titled an HRH discussion paper, and perhaps we can emphasize that some more to address Councillor Silhouette's point and concern, which I do think is a valid concern. With respect to delaying and discussing more, if there are no concerns with the overall document and it comes down to a matter of, I'm not sure how else to put it, but simple wordsmithing, my only concern is that with the environment we have right now, everything being delayed because of all the issues throughout the world, I'm concerned that we're going to lose time that has passed and will continue to pass until we start to push something forward to council and get this discussion out into the public realm. And then we'll see more and more applications for demolition, and we are just simply not prepared to defend against them in a structured way. And so I'd be hesitant to delay in sending this to council. And we would be clear that this is simply a discussion paper and this is a starting point, but I do think it's important to move this issue along so that we don't lose any more time and see any more repeats of properties that have come before us. And we have said that this should have been prevented and could have been prevented.
Thank you, Al. Yes, I think the intent here is not for this to be a technical paper or a policy paper of any kind. Obviously, discussions will need to be had. As I mentioned earlier, what I'm hearing is there's a framework for that, and staff will certainly entertain that at our future meetings, and we'll look at that closer to understand what technical or policy matters could come out of this. And the answer could be 0, it could be 100%, but to be determined. So to Al's point, it seems like this is more a tone, I guess, that the subcommittee is setting for future discussions, not meant to be technical or policy related necessarily at this point. Dan, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with everybody's comments. I mean, one of the difficulties of trying to put this document together, especially when it's going to go public, is of course the wording. I think to a couple points, Marge, there is a history. I mean, I've read past articles about Richmond Hill's trend for the last 20 years or so, of how it's treated the heritage, and it hasn't been that great that I've read. But again, that's somebody's opinion that they put in. To get statistics and stuff, I would have had to ask for resources from staff to sort of get all that information. So that's the main reason I didn't put that in. Again, this was more of an opinion piece for discussion. So I had the balance between going into a lot of detail and analysis, and at the same time giving enough that would whet people's appetite to talk a little bit more, even do some research on their own and present that to the committee. The comment about Mother Nature is an important one, and it's actually my own. And the reason it's in there is I thought 127 Yonge Street struck me very, very much in the sense that, a lot of people were trying to work through this heritage site and protect it and things, but everybody did their little piece, and by delaying over 10 years, what happened was this building had to be demolished simply because it fell apart, and that's the Mother Nature part. I feel very strongly there's an interpretation here. So, we could go down a road where we would identify specific policies and specific wordings for the bylaws and a number of other elements. But you also could do a simple thing where council, for example, could take an attitude and just instruct staff to interpret things in this particular manner and take a test case and take it through and not change anything. So there's a number of different directions that we can go with this. I agree. I would love to put more backup. I mean, I love to do the analysis and add all that in there, but I had to make this balance between trying to get something through, as Al says, to take the opportunity while it's still fresh in our mind. So, that was sort of the thought behind all that. And I'm happy to make changes if the wording is a little bit off. And again,
And perhaps,
sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's always a struggle for an engineer to come up with the right words anyhow on this sort of thing. And then the last point, you I don't know, you were the continuing care part, that one principle. That's straight from the province, the wording. The one thing that I changed, and that's why I did make a comment that it was adapted from that. The word where it says Richmond Hill or City of Richmond Hill, the province says municipality. So I just simply substituted Richmond Hill, City of Richmond Hill for municipality. But other than that, those principles and the wording stand as something that's published by the province. And as to the presentation to council, I totally agree. This is a discussion paper. This is not necessarily a recommendation. It's to foster discussion, to stimulate opinions on it, to challenge those, to try to get back up if we can. The balance that we all have to be aware of is our time, because the committee doesn't have resources other than ourselves as a volunteer, and staff is there to help guide us and also educate us on some of the current practices and things that go on. But to involve them to get a lot more statistics and other elements, it's something that we would have to ask for, and it would probably have to go through council. And there's a demand on their time right now with all the other things that are going on. So definitely the motion should be to accept the document and clearly identify it as a discussion paper. A second motion would be more internally for the HRH committee itself to break this up into pieces and try and talk it through. I mean, I don't know whether everybody's read through the details to give some thoughts on a structured discussion as to whether it's worthwhile to go through that. That's what I'd be interested in hearing. But I totally agree with everybody's comments, and I'm happy to do whatever the committee feels necessary.
So Dan, there may be some wordsmithing or addition of a word or two to the recommendations. And I'll ask Ryan to put that up on the screen, but I saw Councillor Sylvet's hand up. Did you want to make a comment?
Thank you, Chair Barrows. Yes, it's just a thought that came to my mind, is that with all this ongoing discussion that we're having here at the committee level, and perhaps Councillor West could join in on this as well, maybe it would be to our benefit, and staff, maybe it would be to our benefit to defer this recommendation, for this to go to council until we have a document in front of us that we're all 100% happy with. And we feel that that document is definitely what we want council to see. So while I absolutely agree with Al and appreciate the fact that, we don't want to put any more hurdles in its way, I am acutely aware that we should whatever we send to council should be something that we are all 100% happy with, and the wording is correct. And so it's just a question and concern that I have, and I think we should discuss it and not just perhaps defer it and wait until we have a second round on this, and then decide now it's the time to go to council, keeping it within committee at this particular moment in time, also knowing that we can't be seated in the same room and have these discussions, which is so much easier. And it's just, this is my thoughts here are just simply to protect the integrity of this document as a document of this committee, as a discussion paper document of this committee. Just my thoughts.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor West.
Thank you. I would be happy, and it sounds to me like most of the members of council would also be happy to see, a deferral of this for another small period of time. I actually agree with Al too, that, time is ticking as we go. But if we decided to defer this, I think the value in deferring it, because we have another another meeting in about a month. If we deferred this for a month, the value would be for a group of HRH members to get together and give Dan some further input, and perhaps also give us some time to get put from some of the, not just the wording, but the general directions, and maybe even, this is hard, but maybe come up with some more specific action items that would be proposed. So if that's the value in deferring it for 1 month, I would be happy to support that. I suppose I would be happier to know what Dan thinks about doing that. And if he would be amenable to that approach, then maybe that's the way to go.
Thank you, Councillor.
I think Marge had a comment first.
Yeah,
Marge.
I realize that as I'm sitting in shorts and t-shirt and wish I was out in the backyard, it's almost summertime. And council does break on July 8th, I believe. So I think that's actually our next meeting is after that. So council won't be actually coming back until September. So I think that also gives us a little bit of time as well to do a good job. And I also agree with David that I'd like to see some specific action items from this paper. Like I read it and thought, okay. So I'm trying to think about how is council going to receive it. So I think I'd like to see that as part of it. So yeah, and I would be willing to be part of this discussion of how to present it. I guess I'm a fresh pair of eyes for all the work that's gone into it. So thank you.
Dan.
Yeah, so I'm happy that this is, in a sense, this is a draft for this committee to review. I mean, there has been, the subcommittee has looked at it. We talked about it amongst ourselves. We've made changes that I call the specific draft. I mean, essentially what we're doing here is this is a draft now for the committee. So I have no objections to looking at it from that perspective. And if we don't think it's ready to go to council, I have no problems with deferring it. As to coming out with something specific, there are two things I wanted to come out of this. One is accept the document and wording and all that sort of stuff. So it's a draft, so therefore we have to go through that process. The second thing was simply not a specific recommendation to council, but a recommendation to this committee as to how to approach this topic. There's another reason for me putting in that architectural document, because I've been using it with the subcommittee as a agenda, basically, topics for us to go through. One of the topics in there and one of the principles that you see in the document talks about the criteria to be used for listing and designating property. So it's actually principle number 2, which is identification and evaluation of property to be identified and evaluated based on research and documentary evidence, but also identifying what those criteria would be. So the specific that I see that this document would come up with, which I've tried to put it in a draft form, is that we would talk more about this, but we would talk about it in smaller segments that we were capable to come out with a specific recommendation. So to your point, Marge, maybe I'm misinterpreting the word specific. To me, specific means something that we would recommend to council as a policy change or a bylaw or something like that. And that really is not the intent at this particular stage. It was simply to structure the discussion so that out of there, the secondary discussions, then something specific would come as to whether we want to do something within our own committee to further the idea, or make a recommendation specifically to council, in which case to do that, I would feel more comfortable that we get some more resources from staff to sort of help us through that, which again would have to be requested through council. So that's sort of my thought in presenting this to the group. Nothing specifically to say let's change this bylaw. I mean, if at this particular stage you were to ask me specifically what I would like to do in the immediate circumstance, which would require no changes to bylaws or anything, it's simply an attitude change that council would direct staff that in the case like a situation like 127 Yonge Street, that they interpret that if an owner simply keeps gaming the system and delaying and delaying and delaying, that we should interpret that as demolition without approval, using Mother Nature, and that was the terminology that I wanted to put in there. And that's something, you know, you could make a recommendation right now to council and see where it goes. My expectation wouldn't be high in that particular instance, but anyhow, to give you a sense. So, thank you.
Al, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, as much as I don't like losing time on this issue, I am persuaded by the councillors' comments, and I think I defer to their understanding of how it would be accepted at council. And so I'm thinking that perhaps we reconsider sending it to council just yet and pursue the option, which I believe was Dan's initial intention, in that we discuss this, take the paper as a discussion point, and as a committee, think about how we want to proceed. If we defer it another month or two, that makes sense. And Marge has pointed out that council won't be seeing this within the next couple of months. So I think I find that very persuasive in terms of revisiting the paper and how we're going to proceed. I would just ask that perhaps as a committee, we decide now how we want to proceed with this so that we don't lose the momentum that Dan has given us, and that we decide how are we going to divide the issues, how are we going to analyze them, what is our goal? Are we going to present something to staff? Is our intention to take this to council eventually? Just so that we have some plan going forward. And just the one last point I just wanted to clarify, perhaps with the clerk, since this is part of the presentation on our agenda, is it not already supposed to be part of the public record, or is it something that we have to remove, or just perhaps if it's already part of the public record, we clarify that it's just a discussion paper meant for discussion within the committee. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, if the intent is to, from what I'm hearing, to escalate this up the chain, if you will, from the subcommittee to the committee, and then after the committee reviews and comments up to council, then it could be as easy as, making just that comment and the recommendation that it be received by the committee as a draft for discussion, and a deadline be set for committee members to submit their comments back to the subcommittee to then come back, as a item to be then in the next meeting received by council. I saw Ryan prompting to say something there with regards to how we proceed. Ryan?
Through you, Chair. So the agenda is already public. However, what happens on the motion is up to the committee. I'm just going to put something on the screen, which I think will perhaps answer what is possible. That we adjust the motion and its discussion materials, and that we defer it to permit additional discussion time. That therefore you can, as a committee, determine what it is that you'd like to do, and you've discussed future actions, that sort of thing. Just to point out that the next two meetings, one is July 7th, that's the next scheduled one, and then followed by summer recess, and then September 15th. So I leave it to committee members to decide, but I think this would be perhaps appropriate in what it is that you're looking for.
So while you're setting that up, I see Councillor Silivette's hand up. Councillor?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with that, and I would move that. I would just ask that we say the draft discussion materials. I believe draft needs to be inserted there because that makes it, thank you, that makes it very clear. Yes, I fully support that, and I think that it's, I thank the committee because I believe we've had a really good fulsome discussion here about how we want to move forward with this, because I think we have something here that is pertinent and very, very real to what we do as the Heritage Committee under the constraints, so to speak, of the Ontario Heritage Act. So with that in mind, I would like to, through you, Mr. Chair, just direct a question to Joanne. Joanne, a couple of things. Firstly, would staff be in agreement to peer review the draft once we've completed it on a committee level before it goes to council for review or for their information? So I believe that we need the peer review of staff to ensure that we have everything statutorily correct in this paper. The other question part B to my question is with regards to the Ontario Heritage Act, what is the mechanism that council has or this committee has to recommend to council with regards to fining a landowner when it comes to demolition by neglect, which creates a situation as we have with 127, because we are using that right now as our example. Is there a mechanism under the Ontario Heritage Act that permits a council to fine the landowner, or is that something that can only go through the York Region prosecutor?
That I'm not clear about, but there's certainly the property standards bylaw for designated property provide the bylaw officer the ability to fine an owner and to prosecute it. But it is only through the York Region system because the Ontario Heritage Act itself is not a criminal law based. I mean, it really isn't anything to do with that. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so, but I don't think so. The property standards bylaw for designated property was established so that I guess there's a bridge between prosecution and the heritage component, heritage side of sort of development issue. So that's my understanding. In the end, it is council's decision what they want to do with the bylaw. With the negotiation with the owner as to the amount of money that they would charge. I mean, the prosecution could be a decision, but it's up to council to adhere by it or not.
Okay.
In terms of working with the Heritage Subcommittee, of course, I have no problem with that. I'm happy to assist in terms of the general accuracy of the background. I had a number of discussions with the chair and Dan, and I think that it's clear from my impression that this document should be the voice of the committee member, and that my involvement, it's fine, but then my tendency will be to make that the way I'm used to writing something. And so again, because I would say that this document, my understanding in talking to Dan and the chair is that it is actually the voice of the committee, the concern coming out of it, and absolutely, the research that is provided by Dan is substantial, and it's actually echoed by everyone in the committee, and I can provide technical clarity. And I think that is where I think I should position myself. This is my understanding. I don't know if everyone would agree.
Thank you, Joanne. That's exactly what I meant. Thank you so much. That's what I would like to see. So I'm prepared to move this motion to defer it, and I think that when we come back, we'll have in our possession a document that very clearly indicates how this committee, what this committee believes, and how this committee believes that we should be moving forward on a really serious matter such as this. So thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. I have Al and then Dan afterwards. If there are any other closing remarks, I would like to ask Ryan after you, Dan, to then put the recommendations up on the screen so everybody can see what we're dealing with. And if there's any changes that need to be made, we can talk about that. So go ahead, Al.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm prepared to vote on this. my position hasn't changed since I last spoke. Councillor Sivits brings up an interesting point, and I thought this is probably the most appropriate time in the structure of our agenda just to ask it. And perhaps it's something we could ask staff to look into. My understanding of the Heritage Act is that because it's a municipal matter, that municipalities that decide what they're going to designate, I would think that it's appropriate for Richmond Hill to do the prosecution and that it be dealt with through the local court system, the courts, I believe, on high tech. But perhaps we could ask staff to look into it and perhaps consult with city legal, just so that we know who should pursue this, should this be something we look into. I'm not aware of any prosecutions that have been started by the city under the Heritage Act, and perhaps it's something we can just start to clarify so that if we do go down this route, pardon me, we're more informed as to what will happen.
Through you, Chair. Yes, sure. I can do some research, definitely, and provide some information to the committee. We did actually endeavor to have a prosecution case quite a few years ago. It was the demolition of a barn. And we did go all the way to prosecution and were negotiating a fine. However, it was determined by then council to reduce the amount. And so again, it is definitely we can go. I will look into the actual process itself and provide you with the information. Again, it will be something to be discussed, I imagine, among the Heritage Committee members to actually understand the role of council in this and other matters.
Okay, thank you, Joanne. Dan, any final comments before we put the recommendations back on the screen?
Yeah, just two quick comments. So one is, and maybe Joanne can add this to the list of clarification. I'm really still not clear as, like, I've seen the Bill 108. I know it's in legislation. We've talked about elements of it here. We've talked about some of the changes. I've been using that Architectural Conservancy of Ontario document, but it refers to Bill 108 as a guideline for topics that we're going to sort of go through. I'm curious as to what is actual fact in the legislation now and in place. So specifically, we're talking about demolition by neglect, and one of the points that was that I've seen is that the penalty for having a demolition, and we're talking about alterations of particular heritage features that originally would have been identified as being $50,000, maximum $50,000 according to the Act, is now up to $1 million. So I'd be curious, in Al's question as to, the process for going through that. But I'm also more curious as to what, in fact, I'm sort of going blind on some of this stuff. So we talked a little bit about the principles, and they haven't come out yet. Similarly, there's events that they've identified that they would like to clarify as well. And an event is all the points that we talk about all the time when something's brought to the council. So that's the first point. It's just a clarification on that side. And then the second point is, in the suggested structure for discussion, there is a line item in there that says criteria to add listed properties. And that is a specific subject that we have put some time and effort into, the subcommittee has, in identifying a process. We still need to bang out a few things, but we have a presentation to make to the committee as an example of what I'm talking about for taking each of these individual subjects and sort of going through it. So we might go through the same process that we're just talking about right now, just if that helps anybody. But I'm happy with the recommendation to defer and draft it up.
Did
Thank
you
you,
have
Dan.
a question for me? I'm sorry, I wasn't clear then. Were you
Sorry.
asking me a question?
Yeah, well, it's just in addition to the questions that were asked before about clarifications.
I see. Okay.
I would like to understand a little bit more about what is actually in effect and what isn't in effect. because-
Actually, the B108 is actually stayed at this point because of COVID. It has been postponed to at least September 30th. So all the, and yeah, so we receive information from the province every 2 or 3 weeks where there's sort of information coming out to look at how the current legislative processes is being affected. For instance, hearings and the work to do with hearings. Also, we are constantly being updated. I just think that the province were just catching up to trying to manage all this. So the Bill 108, whatever that was presented earlier this year, still remain the same, and we are still using the existing framework. It's not been moved forward as the finalized executed bill. So I can provide you update once it changes.
Thank you, Joanne. Brian, can I ask that the recommendation be put up on the screen?
Through your chair, so the only clarification I would require is to which meeting would the discussion like to be moved to? Again, the next 2 meetings are July 7th and September 15th.
So I have a feeling this is a discussion we're going to be having moving forward. The designation subcommittee will be discussing this topic with the framework that has been presented through these documents. The question though is, are there any changes we want to make to item 5.1A? And there was an item 5.1B that was suggested to be added. Perhaps one suggestion that I'm hearing is the word draft be inserted. Another suggestion might be that at the end of item A, that this presentation or the discussion paper be received by committee. So if we can put those up on the screen, I wouldn't mind all the committee members having a chance to refresh on what we are actually voting on here tonight.
So through your chair, so I've added what we initially had as part B, which was in regards to sending it to council. But that being said, it's possible to, we can send it back to Heritage Richmond Hill. And then when it goes to the next meeting, at that point in time, it would be to receive the revised, whatever changes need to happen, and then from there send it to council for their information.
Okay, so let's pause on the screen for a few seconds so everybody has a chance to read.
Yes, that's fine. I thank you. As the move, I agree with that. There's no need to have any mention of council in this particular motion, so that's absolutely fine. Thank you very much.
Any discussions before we call the vote on item 5.1A and item 5.1B?
Hi there. Hello?
Marge, please go ahead.
Yeah. I'm thinking there needs to be, it's not just permit additional discussion, it's also rewriting, reword, like a further revised presentation needs to be discussion paper. So it's not just discussion, it is the producing an alternative document, an amended document.
Well, it says the revised discussion materials, and to me that equates to.
Okay, I'm still reading part A. Okay.
Yeah, to me that equates to the amended
Should be made
materials.
to the draft materials.
Yeah, if I could ask, sort of in line with what Marge is saying, is to do that, are we saying that that I or the subcommittee would require the committee members to submit to us their points for us to incorporate in? Does that go into this level of detail here, or is that just understood, you know, in the discussion that we just had?
Can I raise the question that one thing, like, are we going to talk about it before or after we vote on this? But like, how are we actually going to discuss things and have a meeting? Like, it's unfortunate we can't sit around a table and do it. So, you know, are there dates? How, like, I'm like, okay, I've now said we need to do this, and I don't know what the process will be. I'm hoping that someone has some great ideas.
Well, we have.
Sorry, go ahead, Councillor.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry. Well, I mean, in my opinion, I think that Dan would probably get in touch with us, and we would have discussions with him, and maybe, you know, he could discuss, you know, have a discussion with David and I at the same time. We have to be careful that it's not a quorum that meets, because then we have to have it clerked and minuted. So, I think that I'm quite comfortable leaving it in Dan's hands, perhaps with discussion, in discussion with Morteza, the chair, as to how we're just going to move this forward in the next few months. I'm fine with that. Over to you.
Okay. Yeah, so that was sort of my question too. So maybe what I'll do is I will talk to the chair, and then maybe I can put a little email together asking for some comments and stuff, and then we could have individual further discussions on it.
So my question back to the mover of this motion, Councillor Silivetz, should the committee be receiving this? And if so, then perhaps item A would be, as opposed to deferred, that almost implies that we're not discussing this, rather be received by the Heritage Committee for discussion.
Well, I'll leave that specific wording to Ryan. I'm fine with this. We are deferring it to another date, which is what the deferral means. And I'm quite happy that we are in the right ballpark here. I'm just seeing what Ryan is typing.
Yeah.
Yes, that's fine. I do believe that this is very clear as to what we want, and I'd like to call the vote on this.
Yeah.
Okay. Al, I don't know if you were raising your hand or you have any other comments before I call the vote?
Oh, yes, Mr. Chair. I was just going to suggest some wording that perhaps would simplify everything, but I'm satisfied if everyone is willing to vote on the material.
Okay.
Okay, I see Marge waving.
Yeah, so it says defer to the July 7th, September 15th meeting. So do we have to decide on one of those, or what's happening there?
Through your chair, we can really defer it to a later meeting. We don't necessarily have to decide on that particular. I just put forward the next two meetings. As at that point in time, there was some discussion about trying to get it to council sooner rather than later. But we can certainly defer to another Heritage Richmond Hill meeting.
So Councillor Silivetz.
Thank you. I'm okay either way. We can perhaps say in the third quarter. I want to make sure that it is done, you know, this year. We don't want it to get lost.
Yeah, my comment is exactly what you said, was that it's the summer months, so if we pick a particular date, that may be an issue for getting some feedback back. But
thanks, Ryan. Yeah, sorry, Dan, I don't mean to interrupt. Yes, thank you, Ryan. Third quarter 2020 Heritage meeting is perfect. Thank you. I'm perfectly happy with this as the motion. Thank you. Okay,
one last comment, Al, and then we'll call the vote.
Mr. Chair, I was just going to suggest that perhaps we just simplify the wording to say that we received the motion, received the draft discussion material, and that will address the issue of the draft discussion material being described as draft discussion material. and that there's no real need to put a definitive timeline in the motion. As long as we all understand that we're going to proceed on this, this certainly can be taken offline, and we can proceed as was suggested, that Dan consult with you, Mr. Chair, and that we as a whole committee communicate by the emails and decide in the process. I just don't want us to get too bogged down in the actual wording. Sometimes there's committees get caught up in the desire to put everything down as a motion when there's not really a need to.
Well, I like timelines. It makes us committed in a way. I don't know, Councillor Silhouettes, is that?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, I agree with all respect to Al. I would prefer there to be a timeline. So staff is so busy with everything that they have to do with council and so many committee meetings, including this one. I believe that it's best that we have a timeline so that we know and staff knows exactly what we're doing.
Okay.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I was just going to say that I'm fine with timelines if we can agree on that one. I do prefer that. I just didn't want us to get bogged down in the wording of the motion. But I'm happy for us to vote on it now if everyone is in agreement.
Okay, thank you very much. So all those in favor of item 5.1 A and B? Any opposed? I see none. That is carried. Thank you very much. That was a very good and fruitful discussion we had. The date of next meeting does not require a vote. It is Tuesday, July 7th, 2020 at 7 p.m. Before I call for a motion to adjourn, I wanted to thank the esteemed members of council, my vice chair, Marge Andre, and the dedicated volunteers tonight for showing up and contributing to this session. With that said, can I have a motion to adjourn tonight's meeting?
So moved.
Al, thank you. All those in favor? Any opposed? Meeting is adjourned.